Hi everyone, my name is Ali Stiers, and today I'm going to be talking about politics and conflict within communication. So, to start out with our introduction, the value of ACS 304 in everyday life. So, ACS 304 is super prevalent, I feel like, in everyday negotiations and conflicts. Firstly, it teaches us strategic ways to negotiate and handle conflict, and it also helps us understand the way others communicate. It's so important to be transparent when it comes to communicating because if you're not, it can definitely lead to misunderstandings and more conflict that was not necessary. There's also a value of understanding conflict and negotiation. It creates less miscommunication and leads to more understanding. This just comes back to being transparent. We can't read each other's minds. So, the best way to avoid a miscommunication and get what you want out of a conflict or negotiation is to communicate clearly and transparently with the other party involved. So, conflict in politics. Obviously, the United States political climate is kind of tense right now. There's a lot of conflict and differing ideas within our country. So, I interviewed two relatives with opposing political views. One is conservative, the other is very liberal. I noticed several similar as well as different concepts involved in their communication. So, I would like to go ahead and talk about this now. So Joni is my aunt who is extremely conservative, and Megan is her daughter, which is my cousin, who is extremely liberal. So the first thing I noticed with Joni within her interview and just her conversation I watched with Megan, she just wants to attempt to change Megan. That's her goal. You should never go into a conflict with your goal to change the other person because you're just going to be disappointed and it's just going to make the other person upset. The most important thing to do is just communicate how you feel without trying to change another person's perspective. She was also not learning the other person's side of the story. So she wouldn't understand why Megan had these beliefs. She just believed that Megan was wrong and she didn't know why. She didn't want to know why. You should always learn the other person's side of the story because if you don't, it just leads to more conflict and obviously more misunderstanding. She would also exaggerate always and never. So it was always, Megan always argues with me. Megan never listens to me. This is extremely toxic when it comes to a conflict. It's so important to give this person a chance to change or to do something differently. Saying always and never really defeats the other person if they were going to come into the conflict in a different way. Megan also had a few concepts that were not contributing to their relationship at all. So she was coming across as unapproachable. When Joni would try to talk to her about how she was feeling, she came off very cold. She didn't want to hear what she was saying. She also was expressing feelings and placing judgment. So she was talking about why she felt the way she did and simultaneously judging Joni for not feeling the same way. That's really just going to defeat Joni and not make her want to understand why Megan thinks the way she does because she already feels judged for having her beliefs. Megan also is having too much control over her reactions, which is a weird thing to say, but I'll explain. So Megan came into the conversations already knowing how she wanted to react to what Joni was saying. So when Joni would tell her something, instead of Megan reflecting and thinking, how does this actually make me feel? She would just be mad or upset because that's how she wanted to feel coming into the conversation. She was controlling her reactions too much instead of allowing herself to have a natural and organic reaction. I also noticed several concepts that were present in both parties during the interviews that I conducted and the conflict or the conversation that I watched. So they were both very stubborn and stuck in their ways, which is pretty self explanatory as we can see from the other concepts being used. But it was just very clear that neither person was going to change their beliefs, and they were both very stubborn and both believed the other person was wrong. Bouncing off of that, they also each thought the other person was the problem. So Megan thought her mother was the issue in the situation. Her mom thought Megan was the issue in the situation. Instead of having a reflection and thinking, maybe we're both the issue in the situation. Maybe we could both do better, which would be a healthy way to communicate. Instead, they just blamed each other. They also were avoiding the opportunity to take lead in the conversation. And by that, I mean, they just kept arguing back and forth, and no one decided to just take lead of the conversation and say, here's where we need to go with this so we're not arguing or fighting. They were also trying to control each other's responses, which is kind of very similar to what Megan was doing when she was having control over her reactions. So they weren't listening to each other. They were just preparing what they were going to argue back while the other person was talking, instead of really understanding how the other person was feeling. They also had a really big lack of letting go. So they both held really big grudges towards each other when it came to these political feelings. And that meant they weren't going to let things go. They were going to stay mad at each other, which is just extremely unhealthy in their relationship and just caused more conflict and misunderstanding instead of just listening to each other. So I came up with three strategies that I think would really help their relationship. First, they need to view conflicts as opportunistic. This means instead of Joni bringing up something and Megan being like, oh, here we go again. How about we take this time instead to clearly listen to each other and maybe take this as an opportunity to teach Joni why you feel the way you feel, or take this as an opportunity to learn why Joni thinks this way, and vice versa. Honestly, when it comes to conflicts, we could all really learn from each other. And that's just why we should really view this as an opportunity. They also needed to define appropriate behavior prior to entering the discussion. This means instead of it getting too heated, them yelling at each other, they needed to set some ground rules. If we're going to talk about politics, this is where we are going to go. This is what we're going to talk about. These are off the table. Yelling is off the table. Name calling, anything like that that's going to harshen their relationships and hurt feelings. They just needed to go ahead and set up some ground rules so they could talk about their beliefs without hurting each other's character. Another solution I came up with was starting the conversation with a compliment. Although it sounds kind of silly, this is a really good way to loosen up and to start out not being mad at each other, but a little happy with each other before you dive into a conversation that's a little tough to understand or communicate with each other when you have opposing views. So I think applying these three strategies would mean a much smoother relationship between Megan and Joni. So, all in all, I think their relationship does have a lot of growing to do, but I think there is a long way for them to go. And I learned a lot in this class this semester. So thank you so much. And thank you guys for watching.